Hello and welcome back to Crushing Comics, the show where I fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. I'm your host, Peter, and we are here to unpack some oversized books. Such as this one. Ugh. I was thinking about survival skills. Maybe wilderness survival skills, maybe not, depending on how you think about it. Where did you learn yours? Like, balancing your checkbook. Did your parents teach you that? Did you learn that in school? Some people had a class in school. I never had a class in school. I just love numbers and spreadsheets and had always been the kind of person who made them. Even like when I first got my first computer, I remember one of my favorite things to do is that there were spreadsheets and I could list my whole music collection. This was of course pre-iTunes because I'm old. And like rank them every week. I would go through and re-rank all of my CDs and like all of my favorite songs and just keep spreadsheets to track that. So like, yeah, I'm gonna balance my bank account. But what about like other survival skills, both digital and financial and also like physical? So do you know any of these outdoor survival skills, right? And if you do, was it because you were in the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts? Or do you just know? Did you like pick them up from like television or something? I do remember one time starting a fire in the backyard of this kind of creepy kid that lived behind my grandmother with a magnifying glass, so clearly I could do that if I had a magnifying glass. But I don't know anything about the outside world. It's actually really funny. My wife was a Girl Scout, and her mother is extremely knowledgeable about the outdoor world, and I don't know anything. Like I'm like, ooh, it's a plant, and that's the extent that I know. And we'll be on, so I'll go on runs and hikes here, and I'm like, oh, there's some pretty flowers or whatever, and she sees it, and she's like, oh, this is a varietal of the blah blah blah, but don't lick it. It's poisonous. I'm like, who knows that? But it's not just that, like, she knows all sorts of practical things about just, like, being outside and surviving. I don't know. So I just think it's really interesting to think about how we acquire that and how those skills, like, have trickled away from us as it gets to the point that we, like, need to be in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts to learn them, right? Like, how far we've come as a society where you can go through your whole life and never need to know anything about the outside world and probably get along just fine, which was me. So it's funny because my daughter now is learning some of this stuff. And I find that I'm saying to her, like, you gotta ask mommy, which is really funny to me because, A, we really try to stay away from any kind of like, oh, go ask the other parent thing because we're equals in this situation, but also because I just don't know. It's not just like, I don't want to explain, I like really can't explain, and then I get to learn, too. So what did we pick up today? Oh wow, this is a big old hunk. This is a big old mixed hunk. We'll see if we get through this whole thing today. Okay. Okay. This first book is The Mighty Avengers, Dark Reign. And this is after Bendis was on Mighty Avengers. If we look at who is on the cover, it is Slott, Gage, and all the other ones there are artists. So Brian Bendis wrote Mighty Avengers through the beginning of Dark Avengers, which is actually the next one on the stack, and then he swapped over to be writing the Dark Avengers and gave this to Dan Slott. Dan Slott had been writing Avengers the Initiative, which was sort of like the young and training Avengers team, and was that still running at this point? I want to say maybe yes, it was still running at this point, and he also was writing this book. So the thing for me is, Brian Bendis was doing this very specific thing on Mighty Avengers at the beginning where he was writing it in this like throwbacky way where it actually had like thought balloons and narrative boxes and had a kind of older school feeling sort of Avengers team, and it was kind of delightful. It was very different than what he was doing on New Avengers, and Bendis is smart enough to know that like he wanted to give that contrast. He didn't just want to write two of the same book. He wanted to write one book which was this very newfangled idea of the Avengers, and one book which was this very old school version of the Avengers. And you know, Slott I think is really vastly underrated for his work outside Spider-Man. His work on Spider-Man is what it is. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But I think when he's outside of Spider-Man, he tends to be really good. This is not one of my favorite things of his outside of Spider-Man. And also, it's kind of like, so this is in the wake of Secret Invasion, and it just kind of feels like this team doesn't really have a reason to exist. It's like mostly the Hank Pym team, and like, who's ever getting excited about Hank Pym? Sorry, Hank Pym fans. So that was Mighty Avengers. But what it gives way to is, for Bendis, Dark Avengers. And you will hear me talk some trash on Brian Bendis, but let me tell you, this maybe maybe, is my favorite Brian Bendis book. So Dark Avengers was actually an outgrowth of Thunderbolts, and not just Thunderbolts in general, but a very specific part of Thunderbolts, which was when Warren Ellis took over Thunderbolts with Thunderbolts 110. Now, I could do the whole history of Thunderbolts here, but in a nutshell, when the major non-X-Men franchises of Marvel, so Avengers, Iron Man, Captain America, and then Thor along with them, and also Fantastic Four, went into the Heroes Reborn universe in 1996. There's a massive power vacuum in terms of like the big team to do stuff, and the Thunderbolts form. But the whole key of the Thunderbolts is they're actually all villains who are kind of pretending to be heroes, and sometimes doing heroic things, sometimes not. So that wound up being a really long-running franchise for Marvel, and it's still around in the Civil War period, having just kind of been like rebooted and revised a little bit. And Warren Ellis does this wonderful, wonderful take on it, where instead of taking it in this like, oh, cutesy heroes that are trying to do better way that it had kind of been in the Civil War period, immediately thereafter, he takes it a much more like, oh no, these are really horrible villains, and like, this is one of the only ways they're being contained right now. And it's a great run, and it continues even after Ellis leaves, but Bendis kind of like picks up the threads of that, because Norman Osborn had been in charge of this team of Thunderbolts, and at the end of Secret Invasion, I'm actually going to say it on camera, spoiler alert, because I've been avoiding saying it before, at the end of Secret Invasion, all the heroes are in Central Park in the big throwdown against the aliens, and it's Norman Osborn, former Green Goblin, who finally takes out the final Skrull with like this big 90s looking extreme gun. And so the whole world is totally into him, and they see that, you know, the Avengers were completely infiltrated and S.H.I.E.L.D. had failed, and so they're looking down upon all these organizations, and Norman Osborn comes into power, and the first thing he does is says, well, if I'm going to be in power, I'm going to have my own Avengers. And that's what the Dark Avengers is. So he staffs the team with Avengers that are like kind of knockoff versions of the Avengers you know and love. So he has Moonstone as Ms. Marvel, Wolverine's son Daken as Wolverine, Bullseye as Hawkeye, Mac Gargan as Venom and or Spider-Man, and it's just delightful. And here's why it's delightful for me, because a lot of these characters didn't really have established voices before, like how much Moonstone really was there, mostly in Thunderbolts, and like how much did she have a consistent voice, and go through and ask that about all of the characters. I would say maybe Bullseye is probably one of the ones that had the most consistent voice before that. So Bendis did his like chatty, bantery thing with this like nasty edge, because they all just hate each other because they're real villains, and it like really, really worked. I remember reading it, and I'd read that before I read all of the other Bendis stuff, wherever it is on my shelf now, behind me, because it was about to cross over with Uncanny X-Men and Utopia, so I wanted to catch up, and it was only like one trade to catch up to it, and I just remember being like dumbfounded, reading it like, this is so great. It's really fun comic books, and Bendis went out on top. Bendis and Deodato, actually, who I love from 90s Wonder Woman and will always love, it was like one of the best-selling Marvel comic books, and it went 16 issues, and it was, you know, Bendis had different things in mind. We got to the end of Siege, it was time to relaunch Avengers and New Avengers, it was this heroic age, and Bendis was like, this is all she wrote on this story. I probably could keep writing it for another 50 or 60 issues and sell a ton, but that's not what the story is. And I greatly respect that, and I highly recommend that book. If you can't get the oversized hardcover of it, in 2018 they're putting out a complete collection. Please note that both the oversized hardcover, which was advertised as an omnibus at one point, and the complete collection omit the issues that cross over into Utopia, and I believe that is issues 7 and 8. So they both have a gap in them, and if you want to fill that gap, you've got to get Utopia, which I guess oh, here it is, which is also an oversized hardcover and also in paperback, but they're older and haven't been reprinted, so it's a little harder to get those. The core issues, though, are reprinted in one of the Matt Fraction Uncanny X-Men Complete collections. Let's see what else we have in this stack and how Micro Machines Fast I can explain it. Okay, this is like a weird hodgepodge of OHCs that I don't have a lot to say, so we're just going to do like lightning bolt word association. Invaders Now. Never read it. Marvel occasionally tries to revive the Invaders brand, probably just because they're trying to keep the trademark alive. And it's never really been anything that's super interesting. I think that probably the best it's been is when they did Avengers Invaders and mashed the two up. So yeah, never read it. Although I did eventually come to really like Union Jack. Let's see what's next. Iron Age. So Iron Man, occasionally, probably because of the movies, Marvel gets like all like, we're gonna make a franchise out of Iron Man, and then they give up after a little while. So this was an Iron Man miniseries that actually did have a really interesting concept, which was like, what if Iron Man was dealing with like the Doom's time platform and traveling through time, and through time had to deal with heroes that he knows things about but don't know him, or know him as well at the time that he plucks them out. Now, I'm usually against time travel stuff, and you've heard me say that many times, but I think that that book did it in a witty way because it was not in this, like, this changes everything way. It was incidental, and I think that's when time travel can be fun, when it's about the main character and not about all the changes the other characters and them to track those changes and them come to the present. Like, no, I don't care. The thing that I found funny about this is no Iron Man story is probably ever going to reference it again. It's like a sideline series. It came and it went. Who even wrote it? I don't even know. It doesn't even say. Uncredited writer. No, not really. It just doesn't say on the dust jacket. Rob Williams and Christos Gage and Jen Van Meter. Apparently a lot of different writers. So that's what's really interesting. Yeah, Rob Williams and Christos Gage. Actually, every chapter is somebody different, but Rob Williams wrote the beginning and the end, and I really like Rob Williams. You know who else I really like? I missed wearing a shirt for this. Little did I know I was going to pull this out. Dazzler. I love Dazzler. So that's why this is interesting to me, and it's funny, it probably will never get referenced ever again, but it's written in such a way that that doesn't matter because you can just in your head know that he had these experiences, and that makes it interesting. Onslaught Unleashed. This, weirdly, is kind of sort of like Secret Avengers, like Volume 0. It has the shell of who will become Secret Avengers, and it kind of feels like that team a little bit. I'm talking about the 2010 and Brewbreaker Secret Avengers, and it briefly brings Onslaught back. Marvel played with this a couple of times through the 2000s, and I don't think it ever really stuck really well. And at the time, this was written by McKeever, which is his first name, Sean McKeever, and it was an outgrowth of some things he had been doing with the Young Allies, which was Nomad and some other characters that were kind of like cast-off young characters. It's a fun read. I wouldn't necessarily recommend chasing it down, but I don't mind having it. It's weird that it's an oversized. Like, did they do it just because it was Onslaught or what? Marvel was doing this thing between 2008 and 2012, which you can see in the stack, where they would go straight to oversized hardcover with miniseries. Like, why? Miniseries, if anything, should go straight to trade paperback, and then you just see how it sells as probably a miniseries. And then this is Shattered Heroes. I could go on a whole diatribe about this, but the short story is this is 3 one-shots that came at the end of Fear itself to show where Marvel's big trinity of Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man were headed after that. It's the only oversized collection of all of Fear itself. Marvel really went in hard on line-wide Fear itself, but not even the actual event collection of Fear itself is an oversized hardcover, which is a huge break with tradition that had been stretching back several years and has been kept up by Marvel since then. So this is like why is this one an oversized hardcover? It's not like there's any book that matches it. It's another just queer decision by Marvel. Fear itself gets a really bum rap, I think unnecessarily, probably a topic for another video. I could go on, but it's not an oversized, so it's not going to be in one of these bundles. We'll have to think of another series of videos for me maybe to defend unfairly maligned Marvel stories, which is something I do quite a lot. So this is a big old stack, and I made it through. Oh my goodness. So we got Mighty Avengers Dark Reign, we got Dark Avengers, Invaders Now, Onslaught Unleashed, Iron Age, and Shattered Heroes. Here's their official shelving. I guess we're just going to put them here for now, if they fit. Here, we'll do these two, could go over here. Okay. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Crushing Comics. Please tune back in again tomorrow as I continue to unwrap more and more bundles of books off camera to get us towards a completely unwrapped status and also a completely loving my comic book collection status. Thanks so much for watching.